Hello and welcome back to the Wargamer and another Warhammer 40k painting tutorial. In this video I'll be showing you how to paint the Death Guard Lord of Contagion from the Dark Imperium box set, and I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. You'll first of all need to prime your miniature, and for this I've used the Death Guard green spray paint. If you don't have access to the spray paint, you could use a generic primer and instead just brush paint the Death Guard green on afterwards. Once you've applied the base coat, the next step is to wash over the miniature using Athonian Camoshade. This will darken the colour of the armour as well as pulling into those recesses, which really help to bring out some of those details. Once the wash has dried, we now want to highlight all of the armour panels using Ogryn Camo. Now to highlight, I would recommend taking a thin brush with just a small amount of thinned paint on the tip of that brush. Now I'd recommend a roughly 2 parts paint to 1 part water mix for this. Now to apply the highlight, lightly drag the tip of the brush along the edges. This will leave you with a lighter coloured edge, which will really help to bring out some of those details. Now this next step is an optional one, and for this we're going to be creating the effect of more cracks and fissures that have opened up in the armour. Now for this I'm going to be applying some small lines using Rhinox Hide. Using similar techniques from the previous step, I'll be painting perpendicular lines heading from the edges of the armour. Feel free to apply these wherever you feel are necessary, and apply as many as you like. With the Rhinox Hide lines completed, the next step is to enhance them slightly with a highlight of Krieg Khaki. As before, I'll be using a small amount of paint on a very small brush to do this, and I just want to paint some lines parallel to the Rhinox Hide lines we painted in the previous step. These two lines of colour will together create the effect that a crack has formed and a sharp edge has been created. Overall, all of these cracks and fissures will help to enhance the decayed effect of the armour. The next step in painting our miniature is to tackle the black areas of the miniature, and for this we'll be using Abaddon Black. Now, as with all of the base coats in this tutorial, I would recommend creating a mixture of 2 parts paint to 1 part water, applying this first layer, letting it dry thoroughly, and then applying a second thinned down layer over the top. This layering technique will ensure that you have a strong base layer without obscuring any details. Now there are a number of different areas on the miniature that we want to base coat with Abaddon Black. This includes the sections between the armour panels and the pipes. In addition to these areas, I'll also be base coating the bottom section of the cloak and the cloth wrappings around the axe handle. Once the base coat is dried, the next step is to highlight the black areas between the armour panels and also the pipes using Thunderhawk Blue. For this step, you want to focus on the ridges between the armour panels and also on the small holes around the pipes as well. The reason we're using a blue paint for this step is because it will be much more vivid against the green armour than a grey highlight would be. The next step involves applying a second extreme highlight to the areas we painted in the previous step. For this I'll be using Fenrisian Grey, and instead of painting all of the edges, I'll simply be focusing on some of the upper sections and also some of the more harder edges as well. This lighter highlight will further enhance the detailing and also create the effect that light is reflecting off the surface. Before we move on to tackling the black cloth areas of the miniature, I'll now be applying my layer of Screamer Pink. I'll be focusing my base coat on the top section of the cloak, but also on the spewing intestines and any tentacles emanating from the Death Guard. When applying this base coat, make sure you follow the exact same techniques as we did for applying the Abaddon Black. With the base coat of Screamer Pink dry, we now want to apply a wash of Nuln Oil. However, we only want to apply this to the Screamer Pink that we painted on the cloak. By applying this wash, it will pull into the recesses, enhancing the detail but also darkening the fabric slightly as well. In this step, I'll be continuing to paint the dark pink cloth at the top of the cloak. This time I'll be applying a highlight of Tuskoor Fur. Now this section has some really strong edges, so you should have no trouble whatsoever in highlighting them. The final step for painting the dark pink cloth will see us applying an extreme highlight of Kislev Flesh. When applying this, simply follow the previous steps for extreme highlighting, focusing on some of the more harder edges and corners of the cloth. However, if you're feeling adventurous, you could always apply a few perpendicular lines along the edge of the cloth. This will create the effect of wear and tear on the fabric. In this step, I'll be highlighting the black areas of cloth on the miniature using Xereus Purple. Now on this miniature, there are a number of areas we'll be tackling with this paint. First of all, you want to highlight the cloth on the robe, making sure you pick out all those strong edges and also some of the holes in the cloth itself. In addition to the robe, I will also be highlighting the edges of the cloth that have been wrapped around the axe handle. And finally, I'll be applying a base coat of Xereus Purple to some of the hanging intestines that are protruding from the Death Guard's stomach. Now before we continue with the highlights, we now want to wash over the intestines and also the tentacles protruding from this miniature using Druchii Violet. This wash will slightly darken the paint beneath it, allowing for some more prominent highlights in later steps. It will also pull into the recesses, further enhancing the detail. Once the wash is dried, the next step is to apply a highlight to the purple areas of intestine, and for this I'll be using Genestealer Purple. With this step we're hoping to create a banding effect across the intestine. So when applying your paint, try to keep the segments evenly spaced. For this next step we can now return to the black areas of cloth on the cloak and also the wraps around the handle. And in this step I'll be applying an extreme highlight of Slaanesh Grey. I would recommend applying this in a very similar way to how I applied the Kislev Flesh to the upper sections of the cloak. In addition to this, you can also further enhance the banding on the intestine with an extreme highlight of Slaanesh Grey. In this next step, I'll now be painting the remaining intestines and tentacles using a highlight of Pink Horror. And once before, I'll be applying some banding to these areas as well. To finish off painting the innards and tentacles, I'll now be applying an extreme highlight of Kislev Flesh. As with our previous extreme highlights, you just want to focus on some of the more harder edges, such as those corners and also more prominent features. In this next step, I'll now be applying a base coat of Celestra Grey. I'll be applying this base coat in two separate areas, the smoke emanating from the incense burners and also the protruding skin from the stomach as well. When painting both of these areas, remember to create your mixture of 2 parts paint to 1 part water, as this will really assist in the application of the paint. With the base coat of Celestra Grey completed, I'll now be focusing a wash of Reikland Fleshshade over the skin areas of the miniature. When applied over the Celestra Grey base coat, this Reikland Fleshshade wash will create a very pallid skin tone, which is perfect for the Lord of Contagion. With the wash dry, you can now see that we've achieved a pallid skin tone on the stomach, and we're going to be further enhancing this by applying a highlight of Pallid Witch Flesh. Now I'll be applying this highlight around the edges of the skin and also on some of the folds in the skin as well. I would also highly recommend creating a mixture of 1 part paint to 1 part water, as this will allow for some much smoother skin transitions. Now that we've completed work on the skin areas, we can now move on to painting the other areas of Celestra Grey. Now for this we want to first of all start off by applying a wash of Coelia Greenshade. When applying this wash over the smoke, I would recommend creating a mixture of 1 part water to 1 part wash, as this will allow you to steadily build up the paint over several layers. I would however recommend that you apply fewer layers towards the tips of the smoke and more layers closer to the incense burners themselves, as this will help to create an interesting colour transition between the two areas. Once the Coelia Greenshade wash has been completed, I'll now be applying a second wash over the same areas, but this time using Drakenhof Nightshade. Instead of applying this wash across the entirety of the smoke, I'll instead be focusing where it's emanating from around the incense burners. Once again, I would recommend creating a mixture of 1 part wash to 1 part water and using layers to build up the transitions. The final step in painting the smoke is to highlight the edges of the smoke using white scar. As with our previous highlight, I would recommend creating a watered down mixture of paint and applying it more towards the tips of the smoke as opposed to the base coat, similar to the transitions that we've achieved using the washes. To create the effect of particles in the smoke, you can apply some small white dots of white scar. I would recommend concentrating these dots around the areas closest to the incense burners. The next area on the miniature I'll be painting will be any bone areas. I'll be starting my base coat with Dryad Bark. This step will cover the bony protrusion emanating from the shoulder, but also any skulls or teeth that may be on the miniature. In this next step, I'll now be using Gorthor Brown as a slightly lighter brown and allow us to get the next transition from the darker brown we used in the previous step. When applying this, I would strongly recommend you water it down in roughly 1 part paint to 1 part water, and we want to paint this from the bottom of the bony protrusion going towards the tip. Remember to leave the darker Dryad Bark visible at the tip. For the other bony areas, simply follow the same steps as highlighting as I've used in the previous steps. The final step for painting the bone areas of the miniature is to use Karak Stone. Now this time I'll be focusing it right at the base of the bony protrusion itself. Again, create a mixture of 1 part water to 1 part paint for this. I would also recommend using the Karak Stone to highlight the edges of the protrusion itself as well, in addition to extreme highlighting the other bone areas on the miniature. The next step in painting our Death Guard miniature is to tackle the bronze coloured areas, and for this I'll be using Balthasar Gold. Now there are a number of areas on the miniature we want to paint with this colour, including the incense burners and a lot of the edging on the armour itself. When painting with metallics, be very careful not to overspill onto the areas that we've already painted, as they can be quite difficult to paint over. Before we move on to completing the bronze coloured areas of the miniature, the next step is to start tackling the silver metallic areas, and for this I'll be using Lead Vulture. If you're not sure which areas to paint with the metallics, skip to the end of this video to find a full 360-degree shot of the finished miniature. Once the lead vulture is dried, the next step is to wash over it using Nuln Oil. Now this wash will darken the metallic colours and also pull into those recesses and really bring out the details. Our previous applications of washes on this miniature have been quite subtle, but you can be a little bit more liberal with the application of this wash. Once the Nuln Oil wash has dried, the next step is to wash over both the bronze metallic areas and also the silver metallic areas using Agrax Earhshade. This wash will enhance some of the details on the bronze coloured areas, as well as adding a grimy, oily effect to the silver metallic areas. As before, feel free to apply this wash quite liberally, but be sure you don't overspill onto the other areas of the miniature. Now that we've completed both of the washes, the next step is to highlight some of the bronze coloured areas using Skullcrusher Brass. You should tackle this highlight in the exact same way as our previous highlight. Just use a small brush and lightly drag it across the edges of the bronze area to create a slightly goldish tinged edge. This highlight will go a long way to enhancing the detail in these bronze areas. To finish off the metallic paint, I'll now be applying a highlight of Stormhost Silver. With the Stormhost Silver, I'll be using it in two different ways. First of all, I'll be highlighting all of the silver metallic areas along all of the edges. I'll also be using it as an extreme highlight on some of the bronze coloured areas, focusing especially around some of the more pointed and spiky areas of the miniature. To further enhance the detailing and corrosion of your miniature, I've included a few simple steps. First of all, you could apply a watered down mixture of Skrag Brown over some of the metal areas to create the effect of rust. I'd recommend creating a mixture of 1 part water to 1 part Skrag Brown for this. You could also use a heavily watered down Ahriman Blue, creating a mixture of 1 part paint to 2 part water, and applying this over some of the bronzer areas to create a verdigris effect. And finally, using a targeted wash of Agrax Earhshade, you could create some drip marks down the armour and also focus it into some of the pock marks in the armour as well. And here we have the completed Lord of Contagion, who you can see I've also based. Now whilst I focus on the Lord of Contagion for this tutorial, you could apply the exact same colours and techniques to any of the Death Guard miniatures. Now I just want to say a huge thank you to Alchemists Workshops for providing the miniature used in this tutorial. If you're looking for up to 25% off the retail price of Warhammer, you should definitely check those guys out, and there's a link to them in the description below. Also in the description are some links to both my Facebook and Instagram profiles, which you should definitely check out if you want to find out what projects that I'm currently working on. I also want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys make these videos possible. If you are interested in supporting me as well, you can do so by checking out my Patreon page, which you can find a link to in the description below. From there you can donate to me from as little as $1 a month, which has really helped me in producing future content. So all that's left to say is thanks for watching and goodbye.